Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this session. We have a tremendous array of speakers that I'm about to introduce to you, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. My name is Paul Druckmann, and I'm the chairman of the World Benchmarking Alliance. We have Jennifer Howard Grenville, who is the Diageo Professor of Organizational Studies at the Cambridge Business School. Coincidentally, Jennifer, that's where both of my children completed their Cambridge degrees through the management program there. And then we have Zach Saltner, and Zach is the Professor of Finance at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. And I noticed on your bio, Zach, that your research includes bankruptcy. Let's hope that we don't need that expertise for any of the companies that I'm involved with these days. And last, but by no means least, is Veronica Poole, who is Vice Chair of Deloitte in the UK and the Global IFRS and Corporate Reporting Leader for Deloitte UK. I've known Veronica for many years, and I'm sure this panel session will once again bring out her intellect, passion, and drive. In fact, we were only judges on the Finance for the Future Awards last week. Our category was communications, and frankly, the reporting of the best of those was, in my opinion, well above expectations, which is a good omen, I suppose, in many ways for our session today. Now, Jennifer, from your notes before, your overriding challenge is whether improving ESG transparency and reporting is enough to enable the needed business and investor transformation. Now, we'll come to this as it challenges the current evolution with what I would call transformation. But firstly, with your leave, can we set the scene on where we are currently in disclosure standards through Zach and Veronica, and then come back to you for the bigger challenge? I hope you're okay with that. So Zach, if we can start with you. You talk about two key challenges that you want to bring through today. One being, why is climate-related disclosure so important? And the second, why is there so little disclosure by companies? So can we set up today by explaining, in your opinion, why it is so important that we explore why so little is being reported? Over to you, Zach.
Yeah, of course, Paul. So I think, first of all, as a financial economist, I very much believe in the importance of efficient markets. That is, in prices of stocks, for example, to reflect all the opportunities and risks that firms are exposed to. And I think we all agree that a key risk that lots of companies are facing these days are related to climate change, transition risks, regulatory risks. So for markets to do their job well, for investors to correctly incorporate these risks into prices, investors and markets need to have information on these risks. So how can they get this information? Well, through the disclosure of companies, either voluntary or mandated by regulation. On top of that, we all talk about the transition to a low carbon economy. We need to reallocate resources from the brown sector to the green sector, from brown companies to green companies. And also here, it's important to understand that prices play an important signal role. And for that signal role to work, they need to incorporate all information on the risks and opportunities. Right? So brown companies' stock prices need to reflect the risks. So markets need to have that information. But also green companies need to have information out there on their opportunities so that the price is reflected and markets can do their role by reallocating resources. Finally, let me stress one other point that has been made is important, and that's financial stability. Think back of the big financial crisis. A big problem was that investors and also regulators were not aware of where the risks were sitting. Think of the moment when investors didn't know how much Greek bonds were in the portfolios of different banks, because that information wasn't really disclosed. And so the same is here. When it comes to climate-related risks. For financial stability, it's crucial that markets and regulators have information about climate-related exposures of companies.
Thank you, Zach. That's very clear. One of the things that you mentioned, and I just want to be sure that you meant what you were saying, was that it appeared that you were saying that the only disclosure that investors have are from companies. My view is possibly that there's a lot more information coming from outside of companies these days into investors. Is that true, do you believe?
Absolutely. I mean, there's important information collected by all kinds of other organizations, investor organizations, NGOs, and so on. But still, it seems critical that the companies themselves are making important disclosures on these risks that only they can make. Let me give an example, scenario analysis. So how do different climate scenarios affect companies? That's very hard to assess from an outsider without getting information and access to the strategy of a company. So the scenario analysis, the stress tests, and so on, that's something that only the companies can produce and should produce and disclose.
Veronica, I don't know if you just want to input into that.
Well, indeed. And I think we really need to look as to what's happening with the reporting requirements for companies, because the reporting landscape is changing really fast. And I think Zach covered the current reporting by companies, but I think we also need to look forward and look at what information we can expect to see from the companies in the near future. So perhaps I should just comment on what we have been seeing in respect of that landscape.
Terrific. Please go ahead.
So last year, I'm sure everyone has registered the fact that the IFRS Foundation, which is the governing body of the ISB that sets financial reporting standards, which are now adopted in 144 jurisdictions, issued a consultation on establishing an international sustainability standards board as a sister board to the ISB. An intention would be for this board to sit alongside the ISB and set the standards on sustainability, but ensures that there is connectivity between the information that companies provide in their narrative in the sustainability reporting with the information in the financial statements. And I think Zach was getting at some of these issues that we currently face. So the IFRSF is currently on track to announce the creation of the ISSB by COP26. And to accelerate progress, they have committed to build on the work of the existing sustainability standard setters and framework providers. So they set up a technical readiness working group to take this work forward. And they also confirmed that they will prioritize a standard on climate, given the urgency of addressing this issue. Although they have also confirmed that that's not a climate-only board, and they will quickly be moving on to other ESG topics. IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, had indeed set out an indicative timeline in their recent report, and that clearly shows us that the new standard on climate is to be expected next year. And IOSCO is looking to endorse that and recommend that for domestic and cross-border use by regulators, which of course is what is very similar to the role they ultimately played back with the financial reporting that got us to the point that we are here now today with 144 jurisdictions reporting consistently. So that move is very much endorsed by the G7 and the G20. So do you know what? We are now probably looking at a unique opportunity to make a real difference in how companies report and on what they report on these business critical issues.
And Veronica, what about the other players in this? I mean, it's not just IFRS Foundation that's making moves here. I don't know if you just want to give us just a couple of minutes on those.
So I think, as already mentioned, the Technical Readiness Working Group the players that are supporting the IFRS Foundation are ultimately the existing standard setters and framework providers, which is extremely important because we need to be moving fast and we need to be moving by building on what is already there. So that collaboration between the existing standard setters and framework providers like SASB and TCFD, working with the IFRS Foundation, is going to make all the difference if we are to deliver that climate standard very promptly to respond to the world's needs. And of course, there is a huge amount of good thinking and collateral that can be built upon. TCFD, as you know, is getting traction around the world, and the SASB standards are very much welcomed by investors. They provide the necessary industry specificity. So combining all of that thinking together and putting it into something that can be applied as a consistent set of requirements around the world, capable of consistent application and interpretation by preparers and enforcement by regulators, I think is a big deal. So, and I think that's what's happening now. That's why I'm really excited about these developments.
Yeah, well, like you, I've been in this business for a very long time, and it's very exciting to see this happening at long last. But what I was getting at really was what's happening in Europe and potentially what might happen in the US. Any thoughts on that, or others? Would you want to start, Veronica, and then perhaps others can join in?
Yeah, well, I'll kick off. I think there are some seriously important developments that we need to watch out for. So I think we have seen the European leadership in this space. So Europe has proposed to replace its non-financial reporting directive with the CSRD, which is a title that ultimately stands for the sustainability reporting by companies, and that is currently going through its normal parliamentary process. So we expect it to become a legislative piece that will apply across Europe for companies to report from 2023. So those proposals are quite fundamental in ultimately moving that dial and asking companies to report on a huge breadth of impacts of the company on the environment, on ultimately all the aspects of E, S, and G, but also vice versa on the impacts that company is exposed to, the dependencies, if you wish, that will affect its ability to create enterprise value over time. In the US, we have seen with the new administration significant focus on climate, with the legislative proposals expected later this year. So I think we are indeed in a position now where we have got all the policymakers and regulators moving in this direction, recognizing that we need some mandatory requirements, and they're moving there fast. And I think the biggest challenge for all of us is not to end up in a world where we have got fragmented requirements, legislative or regulatory requirements. And the biggest challenge for us, how do we get to that consistent baseline of reported information by all corporates around the world?
I don't know, Zach or Jennifer, if you wanted to come in at this point on that discussion. No? Okay. All right.
I have just one observation here, and I think we should later discuss a little bit more about the costs and benefits associated with this. But one point here, one challenge here, and I said that as someone who's teaching at the university, is that we need a lot of very skilled people here, both at the companies that are producing these reports that are really knowledgeable in ESG topics, as well as among the standard setters, audit firms, and on the investor side. And I think this is really a challenge, because when you speak to people now, they all tell you, we don't find people that are skilled in that area. Right. And, it's sophisticated. It's you need to collect the data, you need to compile it. We don't want to have, poor reporting and greenwashing. So there's a big challenge on the human capital side ahead of us.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And it's down to you and schools of finance and management in many ways to start breeding the new, as well as educating the old, if you like. I hope that comes through. And same with you, Jennifer, presumably at the Judge Business School, trying to create enough knowledge to be useful. Yeah.
Well, I can
Okay.
just jump in here, if you will.
Please.
I mean, I think the challenge, as Zach said, is definitely in terms of training people and having the human capital to implement what I agree are really exciting developments in the areas of standardization, of reporting, and the movement to actually harmonized frameworks that will enable that. I think there's something as an organizational behavior specialist that I need to speak to, which is also we need to be aware of what gets reported by definition, gets measured by companies, and what gets measured gets managed, the old mantra says. And the really important thing that we're all looking for here is not only that we have really robust frameworks where we can all understand companies' risks around climate, we're really looking for action around climate. We're looking for various companies in multiple different ways to take a whole suite of actions very, very rapidly on climate. And so I think from my perspective, one of the things that we need to be really aware of is when we're creating all these robust measurements, by definition, every measurement is a simplification. And so what are we missing? What are the assumptions that are being made? What is the information that's not available? And I've written about this in the Harvard Business Review, talking about the importance to pay attention to the underlying processes and sort of what I call the causal recipes that connect often what we measure. What we measure is sort of a variable, a point in time, but what we're trying to understand is a process. And that process is really one of impact. And what we often have to measure is not impact, because it's really hard to measure impact. So when it comes to climate, what we're really trying to produce collectively is the impact that we're trying to have is to stabilize our climate, which is a subtle and complex process in itself. What we can measure is individual companies, and even at the level of aggregate industry level, inputs to part of that process. So the inputs are things like, what are your carbon emissions, and, have you bought carbon credits? What are you doing to remove emissions in hard to abate sectors, for example? And we actually have a pretty good connection between the causality of climate change and these actual measures. So we can say, here are your tons of CO2 emitted, here are your tons of methane. We have an equivalency between them. We sometimes have carbon prices that are effective, but there's still a lot of things obscured, even in this area, which actually is one of the more robust areas for measurement. So, for example, when we look at a company's carbon credit strategy and process, we're looking at essentially what they bought. But what we need to be really sure about is what is the quality of those underlying assets, whether it's an investment in forest-based carbon sequestration, how long are those going to last? How subject are they to wildfires and extreme events? Those who offer carbon credits build in buffers for these events, but we've already seen it's daily in the newspapers. We're always underestimating the severity of climate impacts on things like wildfire, which obviously have an impact on the underlying asset of a nature-based carbon credit. Beyond that, even if we're really, really good at the predictive modeling, there's a lot of things we actually don't know. So, for example, soils are believed to hold up to 40% of terrestrial carbon, but it's very, very hard to measure the quality of soils. It's easier to measure the quality of forest cover, for example. So when people are using any of the measures that are rapidly being developed and adopted and standardized, there's a whole lot of complexity underlying beneath those that we're, yes, rapidly filling in the answers to, but we'll never have the full causal recipe. And it gets even more complicated when we get into the social dimensions of sustainability. So I always want our students, our future leaders, people who will be working in this area to stop for a moment and say, right, I'm measuring something, but what am I missing by only focusing on that measure? Because sometimes we can focus on the measure and run very quickly in a certain direction that we're incented to run, missing the larger systemic effects and the deeper parts of causality. We might have unintended consequences, and we might have other things going on that we're not capturing.
I mean, that's incredibly useful to bring into the conversation. Veronica, when you were talking through the existing standard setters and what's likely to happen with the IFRS Foundation, do you think that the measures that they are going to be putting into place actually will achieve that disclosure of impact, that disclosure which leads to actually something happening, actionable?
Well, and I think Jennifer touched upon this. So, metrics and standards, they're just part of the solution. I think there is much more that needs to happen in order to actually to bring about the difference, the change in behaviors that are needed. So I think we definitely need agreed upon global sustainability standards that are developed according to the principles of legitimacy and independence and transparency and public accountability and appropriate oversight and due process. Why? Because that is the starting point that hopefully that means that various stakeholders can accept those standards for reporting. So once we do that, the next big step, of course, is to bring them into force at jurisdictional level as reporting requirements. Because again, what's we need to focus on here is actually what is reported gets measured, and what gets measured gets managed, as Jennifer already highlighted. And I think it is really quite important that we start by asking companies to report on that data. But then, of course, we need to be able to enforce the reporting requirements, and then we need to make sure that the data that is reported is of appropriate quality. And here where it really becomes quite important for companies to start focusing on the information systems that produce that data within their organizations. So we need robust system of governance and controls over that sustainability information. We need that appropriate accountability to be there. It needs to be prepared to the same quality and rigor ultimately as the financial information is prepared today. And it needs to be reported on the same reporting cycle that we currently report the financial information. So regularly, in a reliable fashion, feeding the data into the financial markets and allowing that critical analysis to take place. So, but what I'm talking about here is a behavioral change that is needed within the business, because in order to bring that governance and controls over sustainability information into play often requires an organizational change and integration of these sustainability factors into the way the business is done, into the core of the business. That's not a small ask. That takes real time and commitment from a business. And then, of course, there is internal and external assurance. So lots of different bits and pieces of the jigsaw here if we want to get to the point where we have got really high quality, reliable data that the management can use for its own decision making. And that can influence the decision making, but also the stakeholders can rely on use in their analysis.
I think that's the key point. Yeah, carry on, Zach.
Yeah, maybe I can chip in just a few perspectives from the research that's currently been produced. So I think on the positive side, there's some work now showing that if companies are disclosing carbon emissions, that seems to have a accountability effect, so that moving forward, they're also more likely to reduce emissions, right? So I think it really shows, and there are different studies that have looked at that if we move forward with tough regulation, that there is hope also that firms are changing behavior, not just that investors are pricing the risk correctly, but they're also changing behavior. And then one more piece of evidence that we have from the G of the ESG is that if you look at research and accountability in governance, in executive compensation, a lot has really changed once the SEC required standardized tables on compensation, on CEO compensation. That has allowed investors to make the comparison, institutional investors to engage, researchers to look at the data and draw conclusions. So I think that's the good news. One more challenge that I want to point out is that, of course, once we get the disclosure that you have been mentioning, it will also come with costs. So there was a survey by TCFD about disclosure standards, and 50% of the responding firms were saying that they're concerned about disclosing proprietary information. That is useful for competitors, for example, or suppliers or customers, especially when it comes to scenario analysis, right? So we need to keep that in mind, that there will be costs associated with the disclosure, and that may lead to some companies not disclosing at the level we would like to have because they are worried about the associated disclosure costs.
Jennifer, do you want to come in there?
Sure. And I think it's fantastic that we're talking about the costs and benefits and talking about what this will take at the organizational and business level. And I couldn't agree more with Veronica that there is a massive organizational challenge and opportunity here. And that the companies who, even before we had net zero targets, the companies who were serious about ESG were starting to question, how does this move to the core of our strategy? It's not just something that we can confine to a particular department. And there's been a lot of research actually on organizations who do well on ESG performance are the ones who engage broadly with stakeholders. So they're understanding different perspectives. They're understanding the place that their business has in the world and who it's affecting and how it's affecting. So they're starting to understand, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of systems and processes that they're influencing and being influenced by, not just the requirements that they're being held to. And they can therefore get a deeper understanding of the problems and of the opportunities. They also have board level commitment to the issues and regularly engage their boards in conversations around these. So again, signaling that it's a core part of their strategy. And they also are able to see ways in which their existing organizational cultures can support actions and innovations on sustainability. So it makes no sense to take a company that is very risk averse, for example, and start declaring that it's going to do all sorts of radical things like carbon storage or what have you. That might be much more appropriate for a company that finds itself in a very innovative and fast-moving kind of culture. So thinking about how do these issues actually leverage the core sort of strategy and culture of the organization is really important. And there's one final piece that I think is really important to discuss in the context of the standards and disclosure, which is that, as long as we're driven by very short time frames and time cycles, we will be stuck with a tension between the sort of longer timescales that we all need to think about and act on, invest in and innovate towards that will enable us to get to net zero by 2050 versus the short timescales on which reporting and other requirements are held. And again, there's research that shows that when CEOs, when senior managers are able to adopt a longer time scale in terms of their thinking and planning, they actually become more innovative. They make deeper investments in things that will pay off in the future. And that's what we also need in order to move towards the actions that, yes, will be costly and will be somewhat risky for firms.
Whilst we're talking about costs and things, have any of you had thoughts about the SME sector, the smaller side of business? Zach, I don't know if you've seen any research or anything from that point, because we are generally talking about the listed companies so far.
Right. I think a few points here. A big part, as was just explained also by Veronica and Jennifer, is that firms need to have processes in place, structures in place, procedures in place to collect, compile, and report the information. And it's plausible that there's a big fixed cost involved in this. So SMEs will, of course, have a relatively larger burden when it comes to these costs. But another point that is important here is that we really make sure that we are also targeting the non-listed firms when it comes to these rules and regulations, because a lot of the large carbon emitters are actually non-listed firms. Right, and so we have to go through disclosure requirements for debt instruments, for example, because that's what they are issuing. Right, and a final point here also, and it doesn't just apply to disclosure regulation, but more broadly to everything we have in mind when we're targeting public firms, for example, through investors, is that we want to avoid that the big carbon emitters are either selling the big carbon emitting parts. And then these parts are being taken private by private equity, for example, or if they're going dark at all as a whole, right, to evade this, then we haven't achieved a lot. Then they are not in the public domain anymore. And, we have to ask, how do we go after them in order to achieve our targets?
Yeah, and it's interesting with the World Benchmarking Alliance, we have our SDG 2000, which are the 2000 most companies that have the most impact on society and the planet. And interestingly, what we've done is we've looked not just at the listed companies, but at those others that are either private or state owned. And it is remarkable how impactful those are. We mustn't forget them. That's still moving to the large rather than the smaller companies that we were talking about. But I think in many ways it is probably a cost and resource issue, and we also need probably to remember that in many ways, although there are a huge volume of SMEs in the world, they don't have as much impact as the very big global companies. So whilst I don't think we should ignore them, it is something that we need to take into account. I just wonder if there's anything that any of you have not been asked that you're desperate to say in the last couple of minutes before we close this session. So can I start with you, Jennifer? Is there anything, any closing comments you'd like to make?
Absolutely. And I think it segs very, very nicely off what Zach raised and what you've just spoken to, Paul. I mean, I think in this area, we need to expect the best of all companies. That means SMEs and everyone else. But really, when you get right down to it, we have a climate emergency. We have a very short amount of fuse to run in terms of carbon emissions that we can continue to emit. So we know where the stopping point is, and we need to do the math. We need to do a careful sort of collective life cycle assessment and focus the energy, efforts, and investments, and yes, accountability towards those who have the biggest contribution. So those who have the biggest contribution and we can get the biggest bang from the buck from, I believe those are who needs to be held to account on climate issues. But other ESG issues, absolutely, we need to pay a lot of attention to all companies. So I tend to agree that we need to follow where the emissions are coming from. And that's not simple. That's not just saying there's only 20 firms who do this, because actually every level of the economy, every individual is contributing in some ways through those. But I think what it points to as well is the bigger question of accountability and reporting. It's at the individual level, and as Zach pointed out, it's only for listed companies. So we reward or punish on the basis of individual firms' actions. But on most issues, including climate, really what we're seeking is, again, a collective sort of outcome. And so we don't have very good ways to, you can apportion things out and you can say this is what a given company's contribution is. But ultimately, we're actually looking for more collaborative, more system-wide approaches that might avoid some of these unintended consequences. I could radically reduce my carbon emissions by selling off a division or by doing something with renewable energy, but I might be shunting those to a different part of the globe, and that doesn't help. And so I think we need to acknowledge there's a bit of a mismatch between the sort of individual reward and the collective outcome and impact that we're all seeking.
Right. Thank you very much. Zach, you've got 30 seconds, if you don't mind. One final comment?
Well, of course. I think just one comment. I think institutional investors have played a critical role so far in pushing lots of standard setters and firms and disclosing more. And I think it's important that even if mandatory disclosure is coming, that they keep up the pressure and make sure in particular that the mandated disclosure has high quality.
Thank you very much. And Veronica, you have the last word.
Thank you. Well, I think consistent, comparable information on ESG matters relevant to enterprise value is critical to efficient operation of capital markets, and it's an urgent priority. And of course, it's not an answer to everything. We must recognize that business and capital markets alone cannot solve all the world's problems. We need decisive and urgent policy actions too. But transparency goes a long way.
Thank you, Veronica. And thank you so much, Veronica and Jennifer and Zach, for your fantastic insights. We could have gone on for a lot longer, but I think we all really appreciate it. Can I also thank the audience for listening to us, and hopefully you will be inspired by our panelists today. And then in terms of the conference itself, please join us for the next session, which will start shortly. Thank you very much indeed.